Well, I have a talk that, as Pastor mentioned, that I felt was election sensitive. And one of the books that I'm covering is Who is the King in America? And with that, did you know there were two waves of pastors that had an influence on the founding of America? And why is this important? Because they're still having an influence today. And so let's talk about them. The first is the 1600s. They're Calvinist Puritans. And in the 1700s are Lutheran Pietists. Let's unpack this. So Calvinist Puritans, they did something really unique. They came up with a form of government without a king. So one of the things that I did is I spent a couple years researching every civilization that has ever existed on planet Earth, and just to see what the most common form of government is. And you know what it is? It's kings. Nimrod, Tower of Babel, and pharaohs, and Caesars, and Kaisers, and sultans, and tsars, and Maharaja, Genghis Khan, Julius Caesar, Attila the Hun. And as the centuries go on, the kingdoms get bigger, because with military advancements, kings can kill more people. Instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, they can kill with a bronze weapon, iron weapon, failing spear, scimitar, sword, gunpowder. The weapon improves, but it's that same fallen nature of Cain killing Abel. And with technological advancements, kings can track more people. Did you know Augustus Caesar wanted to have a worldwide tracking system? It was called a census, right? That was modern. If he could have had 5G and cell phones and satellites, and he would have tracked people that way. But finally, the King of England had the biggest empire that planet Earth had ever seen. The King of England was a globalist. He was a one world government guy with him at the top. We don't like one world government guys. And now anybody that does any type of plotting can see that at some point it's going to max out on a global level. And Jesus says, wheat and tares grow together till the harvest. Now, wherever there's a king, if you're friends with the king, you're more equal. If you're not friends with the king, you're less equal. And if you're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason, or you're a slave. I thought slavery started in 1619. No, wherever you had the first king on top, you had slaves on the bottom, right? And so this is the norm for human behavior. Kings are nothing more than glorified gang leaders. I mean, if we got rid of all laws and all police tomorrow, what would happen? Well, it'd be okay for a day or two, and then people start robbing stores, and if they got away with it, they start going to house, and they start getting away with it, and pretty soon you'd have gangs. And you would have to pick which gang you're going to align with. And then that gang leader would say, okay, I demand loyalty. And as the weapons improve, that's the default setting for human government. And now, it was world-changing to find a way to rule people without kings, right? For people to rule themselves without a king. Now, where did that idea come from? Believe it or not, it came from Calvinist Puritans. And a century before Europe's Age of Enlightenment, you had these Calvinist Puritans. Now, where did they get their ideas? The Bible. What part of the Bible? The first 400 years out of Egypt before King Saul. It's called the Hebrew Republic. And it's the first time that you have a nation with millions of people and no king. I mean, it stands out like a thumb when you look at world history. Here, they leave the Pharaoh for 400 years, there's no king. And it worked because everybody was taught the law, and everybody was personally accountable to God to follow the law. So you're about to steal, nobody's around, and then you think, oh, God's watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates something called the conscience. Anyway, the Calvinist Puritans during the 16th century were called Christian Hebraists because they even taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. This is the coat of arms of Yale. They still have Hebrew characters on it to this day. So what is the Hebrew Republic? It's that first 400 years out of Egypt before King Saul. It's the first time in history you have a nation with no king. And where there's a king, you're friends with the king, you're more equal. You're not friends with the king, you're less equal. You're an enemy of the king, you're dead. Well, for 400 years, there was no king. And the law specifically said there's no respect of persons in judgment. Rich or poor, everyone's to be treated the same. It's the beginning of the concept of equality on planet Earth. So the Calvinist Puritans liked the pre-King Saul history of Israel, but the King of England, he liked the Saul and on period. So both of them are quoting from the Bible. But King James and all those kings, they're going from the King Saul and on, the anointed king. But the Puritans, Calvinists, and the Pilgrims, they look to the pre-King Saul period as God's original plan with no king, and it worked because everybody was taught the law. Now, kings have subjects who are subjected to the king's will. Democracies and republics have citizens. The word citizen means co-sovereign, co-ruler, co-king, right? And people say, well, what's the difference? A democracy, the word demos means people, krasia means rule. So in a democracy, Like Athens, there were 6,000 citizens. Every citizen had to go to every meeting every day to talk about every issue. You didn't have time for anything else. A republic is where you take care of your family and your farm, and you have someone in your place that goes to the market every day and talks politics. They're your representative. So the REP in republic is basically the REP in representative. A Republican form of government is a representative form of government. But either way, democracies and republics, the people are in charge. It's an opposite of a king model. And so all governments in world history are somewhere on this line. Total government on one side, no government on the other side. So we'll do a little illustration here. Everybody hold up a fist in one hand and say concentrated power, concentrated power. Fingers apart with the other hand, say separated power, separated power. Now back to the fist, concentrated power, concentrated. That's world history. For most of world history, power is in the hands of the kings and pharaohs and Caesars and Kaisers and sultans and czars. Very rarely is power scattered and separated into the hands of the people. But when they get in panic and fear, they'll let go of the rubber band and it snaps back. So kings rule through fear. You do what they say or they kill you. And power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. They're always going to be preferring their friends and family. Now, the other side is no government. No government would be anarchy unless the people have virtue. And so in ancient Israel's case, they had virtue because everyone was taught the law. But then I was trying to think of a way of explaining it. Imagine if everybody downloaded a behavioral app on their iPhone. Instead of a GPS app telling you where to turn, imagine a behavioral app, right? It's monitoring your blood pressure and your voice volume, and it sees that you're getting upset at somebody and says, alert, alert, don't lose your temper. And then it monitors your bank account, sees it's a little low, and then you're in a store with expensive items and geo-position, nobody's around you, and it does this algorithm, you're thinking to steal. Alert, don't steal. Imagine a behavioral app, and then the Levite priests are the computer geeks that help you to download the app. Right, line upon line, precept here. And, but then the big question is, why would you follow it? What would motivate you to follow an internal moral? As I mentioned before, there's a God who is watching everyone. He wants you to be fair, and he's going to hold you accountable in the future. Right? So you're about to do all kinds of bad stuff, and then you think, oh, God's watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates something in your head called the conscience. If everybody believes this, you can maintain complete order with no police. So this is part of this brilliant plan that ancient Israel had that the Puritan Calvinists decided to adopt and make the American model. We're not going to have a king. How are we going to keep order in society? Everybody's going to believe that there's a God who's watching everyone, wants you to be fair, going to hold you accountable. So when we say it's one nation under God, it's more than just a nice little tip of the hat. It's the awareness that he exists, he's watching, wants us to be fair, we're going to be accountable, that motivates us to follow this internal moral. And when everybody in the country does this, then you can have order with no police. You don't have to lock your doors, women can go anywhere without fear. So this model is called a covenant. And the Puritans got it from ancient Israel, where you get rights and blessings from God, and you're fair and you care for each other because you're accountable to God. And now, if you wanted to compare it to Marxism and socialism, the state is God. You get your rights from the state, you're accountable to the state. And that's a whole nother talk. But the Pilgrims had this, the Puritans had this model, covenant model. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher says, your founding fathers looked after one another, not only as a matter of necessity, but as a matter of duty to their God. And then Puritan founder of Massachusetts, John Winthrop, said, this love among Christians is a real thing. We're knit together by this bond of love. We must make one another's condition our own. Rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us. So you're taking care of your neighbor, not because it's a socialist plan where they're taking your stuff and redistributing it. You're taking care of your neighbor because you love them, right? And you're doing it as unto God. Now, how did these Calvinist Puritans come to found New England? Let's go into Europe. So you got this king, and his name is James, and he's the head of the Anglican Church. Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop of York, deaneries, vicars, curates, and priests, and he's at the top, and he issues mandates. And one of the mandates is, you do not make up prayers, because you could make up a prayer that's wrong. So the government's written all the prayers down and put them in a book called the Book of Common Prayer. And so when you want to pray, you just open it to the right page and read the prayer. And if you're caught with a small group making up your own prayers, the FBI will bust into your house and arrest you, right? And they'll drag you before the Star Chamber, sort of like a January 6th hearing, right? And they will make you confess to something you didn't do, and they'll brand you on the face as a heretic and cut off your ear. And then they'll put you in a room and they don't feed you. And you're there for months and years rotting away. Then they passed the 5 Mile Act. If you're caught preaching within 5 miles of a town without approval of the government, you're a criminal and they'll arrest you. They passed the Conventicle Act. Comes from the word covenant, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm in the midst. And so they would have these small group meetings like in Scotland, and the priest would arrest you. They later changed it to the Riot Act because you could be planning an insurrection in your little Bible study. And you know who was caught during this? Was John Bunyan. And he spent 12 years in prison because he was in a Bible study and they're dragging him away. He says, better to be persecuted than be the persecutor. And that's when he wrote Pilgrim's Progress. Anyway, so these Pilgrims and these Puritans and these Calvinists are persecuted, and a group of them flee to the Netherlands, and we call them the Pilgrims, and then they flee to America. But they're in a storm, and they get blown off course, and they never make it to Virginia. They make it to Massachusetts, and it's too stormy to sail, and so the captain says, everyone off the boat. And they have a question. They say, who's going to be in charge? There's no king-appointed person in our little boat. The whole world's ruled by kings and sultans and czars. Who's going to be in charge of us? They do something unique. They give themselves the authority to start a government. It's called the Mayflower Compact. The word compact means covenant. We, in the presence of God, covenant ourselves into a civil body politic. So let's examine this. This is a church group fleeing from the king who has this top-down form of government. They have a congregational model of government. What's the congregational model? That's where everybody in the congregation's a part. Right? It comes from the word ecclesia or ecclesia, where ek means out of, ecclesia means a calling. Athens had 6,000 citizens, and they'd call them out of their home to go to the market to decide what's going to happen in the city. Jesus chose that word to say, upon this rock I'll build my church. But that word church in Greek is ecclesia or ecclesia. And so in other words, he's talking about his body. And so this body model is the pastor's job is to get everybody to have their own relationship with God the Father through Jesus Christ, who died on the cross for their sins, and then coach them to become mature Christians. Read the Bible every morning, get in the habit of everyday prayer, and then plug into the body. Everything that's alive has to take in and give out. Every muscle for it to grow has to be exercised. For you to grow as a Christian, you've got to be involved. You've got to find something to do. Nursery, junior high, Sunday school, some kind of outreach. That's why I hated the COVID response so much, because it was changing church government from the congregation model where people are ministering to each other. The older ladies see the younger ladies and she's sad. What's wrong? Oh, the baby and the husband, this and that. She ministers to them. And the older guy sees the younger guy say, hey, we want to invite you to be part of our Bible study group. Come on. And this is all happening without the pastor having to do anything. He's giving his message, but those that are filled with the Holy Spirit are going to get around those with a need, and the water seeks its own level, right? You're just going to feel led to minister. And it's ministry that takes place just by the body getting together. Amen. And so when the COVID response was, no, just watch the screen. It's changing it back to this hierarchical model. Your relationship with God is through this hierarchy. I mean, you can take in, but how are you going to give out? You're going to witness to your pillow? No, you have to. Anyway, so this congregational model is what these pilgrims had. And so what we have here is a church group forming itself into a political body. Right? It says, we, in the presence of God, covenant ourselves into a civil body politic. You have a church group, a congregational model church group, forming itself into a political body. Anyway, I thought I'd say that twice just for emphasis. So what happened there, it was a change in the flow of power on planet Earth. Instead of top-down rule by kings and sultans and czars, it's ruled bottom-up by we, just us little group. In the womb of this Mayflower is conceived the child of self-government. It's the difference between a dead pyramid, top down, and a living tree, bottom up, where every root and every little capillary root sucks in nutrients to keep the thing alive. It's the difference between the divine right of kings, do it because I said so, or I'm going to kill you, or we the people. So what happened is you had these pilgrims and Puritans, these Calvinist Puritans fleeing to New England, and you had pastors and their churches founding communities. And so you had a pastor, John Lothrop, and his church founded Barnstable, Massachusetts, and a pastor, Roger Williams, and his church founded Providence, Rhode Island, and the First Baptist Church in America. A Reverend John Wheelwright and his church founded Exeter, New Hampshire, and a pastor, Thomas Hooker, and his church founded Hartford, Connecticut. This was unique on planet Earth. A little greenhouse taking place in New England, where you, instead of having Indian Maharajas and Chinese emperors and Russian czars and Muslim sultans, here you have pastors and their churches forming cities and forming communities and coming up with the laws for the communities. And so let's look at Hartford. In 1636, they flee from Massachusetts, and then they go to found Hartford. And after they get there, the church members go to the pastor and say, "Pastor, can you preach a sermon on how we're supposed to set up our government?" And he gives a sermon in 1638 titled, "The Foundation of Authority is Laid in the Free Consent of the People." This is reflected in our declaration, government from the consent of the governed. And this is different from Europe, where there's kings and sultans and czars, and the foundation of authority is this divine right of kings, right? I get all the power from the creator, and you're my subject, and you do what I say. It's top down. His sermon goes on. The privilege of election belongs to the people. This is reflected in our Constitution, we the people. His sermon goes on. They who have the power to appoint officers and magistrates, it's in their power also to set the bounds and limitations of the power. His sermon is written down. It's called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, and it is the Constitution of Connecticut from 1639 up until 1818. Connecticut is using Pastor Thomas Hooker's sermon as their constitution. That's why they call it the Constitution State. They have it on their license plate. And here's a plaque in England. Thomas Hooker, founder of the state of Connecticut, father of American democracy. Another plaque, Thomas Hooker, Puritan clergyman, reputed father of American democracy. A statue of Thomas Hooker holding a Bible in the old state grounds in Hartford. And at the base, it says, leading his people through the wilderness, he founded Hartford. On this side, he preached the sermon, which inspired the fundamental orders. It was the first written constitution that created a government. Another plaque, it says Thomas Hooker, a statesman, a preacher, a statesman who based all civil authority on the free consent of the people. This was a big development. Instead of top down, it's bottom up. Here's another plaque in Hartford. It says, near this site, Thomas Hooker preached his famous sermon, the foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people. And then representatives of the people adopted as the fundamental orders. What do the fundamental orders say? The people can join ourselves to be as one public state or commonwealth. So who are the people? They're Pastor Thomas Hooker and his church. So you have a church group forming itself into a public state. Let me say that again. You have a church group forming itself into a public state. And why? To preserve the liberty and purity of the gospel of our Lord Jesus, which we now profess. They picked the form of government that would best preserve the freedom to preach the gospel. It wasn't, separation of church and state, get rid of that gospel stuff. No, they picked the form of government that would preserve the freedom to preach the gospel. Here's another plaque in Hartford. They have lots of plaques. This one says, Thomas Hooker's congregation established the form of government upon which the present Constitution of the United States is modeled. Do you grasp the significance of this? His church government, everybody's involved, became the community government, became our U.S. Constitution, we the people. And so in New England, instead of separation of church and state, it was the pastors and their churches that created the state. How could you say, pastor, don't preach on politics, when it's the pastor's sermon that's their constitution? Amen. How could you say church members don't be involved in politics when all there was in Hartford was the church members? There were like no non-church members there to be lazy and let them take over. Now, the word politics comes from the word polis, which means city. Like Minneapolis and Indianapolis, polis means city, and politics is simply the business of the city. And all there was in the city of Hartford was the church members. And so they had one building called a meeting house. That's where the pastor would teach the Bible, and that's where they would gather together and do their city business. The word synagogue means meeting house. That's where the rabbi would teach the law, and that's where they'd get together and do their city business. I mean, why build a separate building just to talk about a different topic? And so when the Revolutionary War starts, the British send over a military governor, Thomas Gage. And what does he do? He outlaws meeting houses. Democracy is too prevalent in America. We don't need the people meeting and deciding stuff. You just do what the government mandates. And Calvin Coolidge says the principles which went into the Declaration of Independence are found in the sermons of the early colonial clergy. They preached equality because they believed in the fatherhood of God, brotherhood of man. The King of England didn't really believe in equality. He believed he was a little extra equal, divine right of kings. Oh, I'm chosen to be the king. Calvin Coolidge goes on that in order that they might have freedom to express these thoughts and opportunities to put them into action, whole congregations with their pastors migrated to the colonies. So that's the 1600s. Then you have a century of pastors and churches founding communities. And Secretary of State George Bancroft said, Puritanism exalted the laity. What's that? Laity is the people versus the clergy, right? And Puritanism says, okay, the laity, the people are going to be involved. We're going to lift them up. They're going to start doing stuff. So that's the 1600s. Let's look at the 1700s. And this is the Pietist Lutherans. Who were they? Martin Luther starts the Reformation in 1517 because he had a personal revelation that the just shall live by faith. So personal to him that he was willing to stand up to the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor and say, unless you can prove me wrong from Scripture, here I stand, so help me God. Very personal to him. But some German princes want to break away from Rome. And they say, this is my chance, kingdom of mine, you're all now Lutheran. And so the people in the kingdom say, okay, we're Lutheran, what do we believe? So for the people in the kingdom, it's not the same personal revelation that Martin Luther had, it's just a new mandated state doctrine. Little more scriptural emphasis, but for a lot of them, it's just, okay, whatever you tell me today, I'll believe. And so a revival movement starts called Pietism that says being a Christian is more than just mandated state doctrine. As good as it is, you have to have a personal experience with Jesus. And when you do, your life will change. And you won't do the worldly things you used to do, like go to bars and brothels and lewd theater and get involved in worldly things like government. Wait, what's that last thing? Yeah, government's filled full of worldly people, so if you're really a Christian, you won't be involved. That's the beginning of this idea that we're just going to preach the gospel. We're not going to get involved in that worldly politics stuff. I'm a little more spiritual than you are because I'm not involved. You just haven't reached the spiritual level that I'm at. You're still at this low level and you're involved in worldly things like government. And I'm more spiritual than you are because I'm not involved. That's where that idea, have you ever met anybody like that? Right? Have you ever met any churches like that? We're just going to preach the gospel. We're not going to get involved. Well, this is where that came from. And it turned into the two kingdom concept that the German Lutherans had. The kingdom of the world, the kingdom of the church, and the two don't touch. There were actually German princes that donated money to the Pietists so they would teach their people not to get involved in the prince's business. Yeah, here's a little more money, just don't bother me. 4 centuries of that allowed Hitler to seize power and kill the Jews. They put the Jews in the train cars and they're crying as they're going past the church. And the church says, well, that's the kingdom of the world. That's the government. We can't do anything about it. So we're the kingdom of the church. And so let's just sing more praise songs to Jesus. Does anybody see there's something wrong there? Anyway, so we have the Calvinist view, 1600s. God has a plan for your life, your marriage, your family, church, your government. Find out what the plan is, put it into place. The Pietists, they were more experienced. You're supposed to have a personal experience with Jesus. And when you do, you won't do worldly things like get involved in government. Now, the Calvinists, they cared about the future, and so they founded Harvard, and a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. And the Pietists, to their credit, they were evangelical, and they sparked revivals, and they influenced other denominations to have revivals. But there's a ditch on either side of the road, so let's examine this. The Calvinists, over a century, they were so plan-focused that they got a little dry and dead and structured and legalistic, and, they were just more into the rules. And so they were called old lights. And then in the early 1700s, these Pietist Lutherans are called new lights, and they're evangelical, and they want a personal experience with Jesus, but the byproduct is be holy and don't be involved in government. And so the Calvinist view is government's dirty, get involved, the government of the king, right? Get involved and try to clean it up. But the Pietists ended up saying government's dirty, don't get involved because you might get dirty. So the Calvinist Puritans' idea is the king's government is limited from interfering with our church. But the Pietist view is, no, the church is limited from interfering with the government because it's dirty and we want to be holy and set apart. Now, we got to give credit where credit's due. The Moravians did emphasize having a relationship with Jesus. And so here's one of the Pietist leaders, Ludwig von Zinzendorf. I have one passion, it's Jesus, Jesus only. And he has a German estate in Moravia near the Czech Republic. And he invites persecuted people of Europe to come, and they're bickering with each other. And then he has a communion service, and they pray all day, all night, all day. They take turns with the kids and the food and the farms, and they keep going praying all week, all month, all year. They keep that prayer meeting going uninterrupted for 100 years. And these Moravians, to their credit, send missionaries around the world. And these are young people. Imagine all the woke energy. Instead of tearing stuff down and burning stuff, they're risking their lives to spread the gospel in India and Egypt and Iceland and Suriname. They're going around the world, and they're not supported by any missionary organization. it's just, a young couple. We feel led to go, to Africa. And it's like, okay. And they just go there and learn the language and learn the skill. And then on the side, and it creates something called the Protestant work ethic. These are people that go around the world. And anyway, they're slaves of South America, Suriname, the Indians, India, Zanzibar, Kenya. They're going all around. And some of them were going to Georgia. And they're on a boat in a storm. And they're almost sinking. But on the boat are the Wesleys, John and Charles Wesley, going to Georgia. Charles was the secretary for James Oglethorpe, and John was the first minister for the colony. And they're panicking because of this storm. And they see the Moravian missionaries, these Lutheran Pietists, just praising the Lord in the middle of the storm. And they're like, you guys know Jesus better than we know Jesus. Anyway, the Wesleys sort of fail in Georgia. They go back to England, and they meet some more Moravians, and they're invited to a prayer meeting. And it's these Pietist Lutherans. And the prayer meeting, it says, in the evening, John Wesley wrote, I went very unwillingly to a society in Aldersgate Street where one was reading Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans about 9:15 while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ. I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation. And an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. John Wesley had a personal experience with Jesus. And so he goes over and lives with the Moravians for 8 months, calls it the religion of the heart. And just like Zinzendorf spread this Pietist revival movement in the Lutheran church, John Wesley spread the Methodist revival movement inside the Anglican church, saying it's more than just Anglican doctrine. You have to have an experience with Jesus. And then he gets his friend George Whitefield involved. And he preaches up and down the colonies 7 times and spreads this great awakening revival. And what are they doing? They're talking about having a personal experience with Jesus. And it's great. But the byproduct is don't get involved. And so it comes to a head with Henry Muhlenberg, the founding father of the Lutheran Church in America. And he has 2 Pietist pastor sons. One is John Peter Muhlenberg, and the other is Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. So John Peter is preaching at his Pietist church, and he goes and he hears Patrick Henry's Give Me Liberty, Give Me Death speech. And he's inspired. He goes to George Washington and says, I want to help. George Washington says, I'm going to make you a colonel, go get your men. And so he goes to his church and he preaches a sermon out of Ecclesiastes. There's a time for all things, time to gather stones, time to scatter stones, a time to preach and a time to fight. Takes off his clerical robe and underneath he has a uniform of a continental soldier. And I just clicked way ahead. And so he has an altar call, and 300 men of his church come forward, kiss their wives goodbye, become the 8th Virginia Regiment, and they fight in all these different battles, even Yorktown, and he's made a general, and he's elected to Congress. And he's in the first session of the U.S. Congress where they passed the First Amendment. And his statue is in the U.S. Capitol, right? John Peter Muhlenberg, taking off his clerical robe. Well, his brother is Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, and he's writing letters to John Peter saying, you have become too involved in matters which, as a preacher, you have nothing whatsoever to do. Right? He said, we're Pietists. John Peter accuses Frederick of being a Tory British sympathizer. Frederick writes back and says he could not serve 2 masters. Right? The kingdom of the world, the kingdom of the church, I can't serve both. And then the British bombard New York, set it on fire. Frederick's church burns. He and his wife have to flee. And then Frederick says, maybe we should get involved. And then he gets elected to Congress, and he's elected the first Speaker of the House. The first Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives is Lutheran pastor Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, who turned from Pietist, we're not supposed to be involved, to we need to be involved. And what did he and his brother pass in that first session of Congress? The First Amendment. Now, does anybody honestly think that these 2 pastors would vote to outlaw themselves? Would they say, pastors aren't supposed to be involved in politics, even though we are pastors and we are involved? No, the First Amendment, as well as the first 10 amendments, were nothing more than handcuffs on the federal government to keep it from becoming a big federalized monster with the president king who rules through executive orders and mandates. I mean, all the Constitution is a way to prevent a president from ruling through mandates and executive orders. I mean, it's to prevent one-person rule. So, 1600s, Calvinist Puritans, and their plan is, God has a plan for your life, marriage, family, church, government. Find the plan, put it in place. 1700s, the Pietists. Personal experience with Jesus, great. Be holy, great. Don't go to the bars and brothels and lewd theater, but they also say don't get involved in government. Well, there's actually a middle of the road. The middle of the road is, yes, it is a personal experience with Jesus. If it wasn't that, we'd all be dead and gone to hell, right? It's a personal experience. But at the same time, we want to be involved so we can leave our children a country where boys can be boys and girls can be girls, and they can have the freedom to hear the gospel. So who is the king in America? Signer of the Constitution, Gouverneur Morris said, the magistrate is not the king, the people are the king. First Chief Justice John Jay, the people are the sovereign of this country. Signer of the Constitution, James Wilson, sovereignty resides in the people. Even Lincoln, the people of these United States are the rightful masters of both Congresses and courts. I love this quote from Grover Cleveland. The sovereignty or the kingship of 60 millions of free people is the working out of the divine right of man to govern himself, a manifestation of God's plan concerning the human race. So who's the king in America? We are. The word citizen means co-king. And so James Wilson said every citizen forms a part of the sovereign power. He possesses a vote. You're exercising your kingship. What about Romans 13? Right? Well, we got to submit to the government. Well, let's read it a little closer. Every person must be subject to the governing authorities. Well, I have a question. Who is the ultimate governing authority in America? It's we, the people. The politicians are your servants. You hire them, you fire them, you vote them in, you vote them out. It'd be silly for a king to have to obey his servant, right? So a republic is where the people are king ruling through representatives. And so when we pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic, we're basically pledging allegiance to us being in charge of ourselves. And so when somebody protests the flag, what they're saying is, I don't want to be the king anymore. I protest the system where I participate in ruling myself. It's like, okay, somebody else will tell you what to do. Now, imagine visiting a king in the Old Testament, going through the streets of Jerusalem, you're witnessing murder, rape, and crime, and you get into the king's chamber. And he looks up at you, he's all worried, and he says, I wish somebody would come along and fix this mess. And you were like, reach over, tap him on the shoulder, say, excuse me, you're the king. You're the one that's supposed to fix this mess. That's like somebody in America watching TV, seeing all the terrible stuff on TV, saying, I wish somebody would fix this mess. Hello, have a finger reach through the screen and tap you on the shoulder. You're the king. You're the one accountable to God to fix this mess. Well, I need somebody to tell me what to do. Since when does the king sit on his throne and say, can somebody tell me what to do? Hey, butler, come here. What am I supposed to do? No, it's your job to get educated on the issues, seek God's will, and you tell your representatives what needs to happen. You're the king. Chief Justice John Jay said, Americans are the first people whom heaven has favored with an opportunity of choosing the forms of government under which they should live. He goes on, your lives, your liberty, your property will be at the disposal only of your Creator and yourselves. If I were to pick one quote that shows what makes America great, it's this quote right here. Your lives, your liberty, and your property are at the disposal of you and your Creator. You get to decide where you want to go to church, who you want to marry, what clothes you want to wear, what food you want to eat, what career. You get to, you're in a sense a king with a little K of your life. And then all of us together are king over the country. And we get a voluntary opportunity of submitting our lives to Jesus, the King of Kings. But it's a voluntary opportunity. The founders realized your worship of God is only pleasing to God if it's voluntarily given. So they're not into theocracy, white supremacy, dominionism. We're going to force it down your throat. No, they fled from England. They fled from that stuff. They wanted a free country where you have a free conscience, where the people decide. It's not forced top down. It's bottom up. It's we. It says, thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power. And then Revelation, it says, Jesus Christ has made us kings with a little k and priests unto God and his Father. So we're little kings and we cast our crowns at his feet, and he's the King of Kings. And now this is interesting. If the people are the king, who are the counselors to the king? You know, in 379 AD, there's a Christian Roman emperor named Theodosius. Right? You got Constantine is like, 313, Edict of Milan, but now it's 379, and you have a Christian Roman emperor named Theodosius. He's going to church in Milan, Italy, and the pastor is Saint Ambrose, Bishop Ambrose. Could you imagine being Ambrose and having the emperor in your church on Sunday? Guess what? That's sort of what we have in America, right? Back in 1965, 93% of Americans identified themselves as Christian. 69% Protestant, 24% Catholic, 3% Jewish. I mean, that's a big amount. Now, it's gone down. We only have 65% Christian now, but 65% is still a majority. So in America, the people are the king. 65% of the people are Christian, which means they go to church, which means they're listening to their pastors. And so in a sense, the pastors are counseling the king. And you have two different kinds of counselors. One tells the king to wake up, the other tells the king to go to sleep. Now the movie Lord of the Rings, I just love this scene. There's a king, Theoden, with a spell cast on him. And he's decrepit, he's got gray hair, gray eyes, cataract, and he has a counselor named Wormtongue. And he's whispering in the king's ear saying, stay asleep, don't get involved. Just wait a little longer. Yeah, your kingdom's being overrun. Yeah, it's getting terrible things are happening, but just go to sleep a little longer and it'll all be over. And there's another counselor to the king named Gandalf, and he comes in and casts the devil out of the king. And right before your eyes, they do the special effect, and the king looks around the room and he says, dark have been my dreams of late, and his hair gets short and his eyes get clear. And Gandalf says, maybe you'll remember your strength if you take your sword, right? The sword of the Spirit, the word of God. So the pastor's job is to wake up the king. The king is in the pews, all right? The pastor has to tell their congregation, some of them say go to sleep. Other pastors, that's why I love Pastor Jack, throws ice water on the congregation and says, wake up. You don't just have the right to vote in America. You're going to be held accountable to God for what happens. Baptist pastor Martin Luther King Jr. said the church must be reminded that it is the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. Now, the most important thing is to bring people to Christ. Yes, I do believe the gospel is the most important thing. Amen. Yep. But the second most important thing is to preserve the freedom to do the most important thing. If you really believe the gospel's the answer, you're going to be involved wanting to preserve the freedom to preach it. Right? Does that make sense? Now, is it holier to be silent and not be involved? Well, what do? These people that think, oh, I'm holy, I'm not going to get involved in government, I'm holier than you, I'm just going to preach the gospel. Okay, what do you do with Numbers chapter 30? It's the silence equals consent chapter. A half a dozen scenarios. One is, if a daughter, while she's still living in her father's house, binds herself with a vow in her father's house in her youth, and her father hears her vow, and her father holds his peace, then all her vows shall stand. But if the father overrules her on the day he hears, then none of her vows shall stand, and the Lord will release her. That's come down to us as vows in a wedding ceremony. And the pastor tells the congregation, if you're silent, you're giving consent. Same way the father is silent, gives consent to the daughter's vows, your silence is giving consent to these wedding vows. Right? If anyone present knows any reason this couple should not be joined, speak now or forever hold your peace. That's now called the rule of tacit admission, T-A-C-I-T, and it's in common law, Black's Law Dictionary. An admission reasonably inferable from a party's failure to act or speak. Right? So if somebody's accused of a crime and they don't respond, they don't say anything, the jury can assume that they're guilty. So if church members hear vows and they're silent, they're giving consent. If church members hear about stuff that's going on in the community and they're silent, they're giving consent. And if you give consent to sin, you share in the guilt of the sin, you'll share in the judgment of the sin. You know, it's scriptures, Leviticus 19, it says, confront people directly so you will not be held guilty for their sin. Now, what's an example in the Bible of somebody being silent and being guilty? Aaron. Did you know Aaron did not get to go into the promised land because he did not confront Moses and he was silent? Let's read the story. Numbers 20. Moses and Aaron went to the door of the tabernacle, and the Lord spake unto Moses, take the rod, gather the assembly, thou and Aaron, speak to the rock, and it shall give forth water. And Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice, and water came out abundantly. Right? He was supposed to speak to it, and he hit it. He disobeyed. And at the end of the chapter, it says, and the Lord spake unto Moses, Aaron will not enter the land because both of you rebelled against my command at the waters of Meribah. It's like, oh, we just read the chapter. Aaron didn't do anything. He didn't say anything. That's just it. He was at the door of the tabernacle. He heard God tell Moses. And when Moses lifted up the rod and hit it the first time, Aaron was probably a little surprised. That was Moses' sin. But when Moses lifted up the rod the second time, Aaron knew what was coming. There's no record of him saying, Moses, hold on a second. Wait, Moses, you should. No, he was silent. And God said, Aaron, you rebelled against me. You don't get to go into the promised land. You know, Mordecai told Esther, there's a decree, there's a mandate from the government that says all Jews must die, and if you remain silent at this time, deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. Here's one, Leviticus 20. Any Israelite or any foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Molech is to be put to death. If the members of the community close their eyes when that man sacrifices one of his children to Molech, I, myself, will set my face against him and his family and will cut them off from their people together. Proverbs 24, rescue those who are unjustly sentenced to death. Don't stand back and let them die. Don't disclaim responsibility by saying you didn't know about it. For God, who knows all hearts, knows yours. He knows you knew, and he will reward everyone according to his deeds. So what do we do when you have a governor sign a bill that says you can kill a baby after 28 days? If you're silent, you're giving consent to killing babies. You know, in World War II, the two kingdoms, right? The kingdom of the world, the kingdom of the church, and the kingdom of the world was killing Jews. And the church was silent. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, I cannot be silent anymore. And he started a confessing church movement. And he says, I got to speak out. Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. God will not hold us guiltless. And Martin Luther said, if I profess with the loudest voice and clearest exposition every portion of the truth of God, I'm just going to preach the gospel. I'm going to preach a really good message. If I profess the loudest voice, clearest exposition, every portion of the truth of God, except that little point which the world and the devil are at that moment attacking, I am not confessing Christ, however boldly I may be professing Christ. Where the battle rages, there the loyalty of the soldier is proved, and to be steady on all the battlefield besides is mere flight and disgrace if he flinches at that point. You know their tactic is to guilt trip Christians into being more Christian than Christ? They say, if you're Christian, you'll tolerate everything. You'll be silent when they teach this alternative sexual agenda to the kids. Question, would Jesus teach that agenda to the kids? Jesus said, he who made them at the beginning made them male and female. And that God made these precious little boys and girls in his image. So they're telling you, if you're really Christian, you'll be silent and let them teach something that Jesus would never teach. So if you're really Christian, you won't act like Christ. And while we've been sitting back, here's just an article last week or so. It says Montgomery, Maryland's largest school district sees a 500% increase in non-binary trans students. They pull out like a rainbow full of colors, and each one represents a sex. And which one are you today? And these little kids, oh, what do you feel like? And of course, the fuddy-duddy ones are these kids that believe there's just a boy and just a girl. Oh, you're no fun. Here's another one. Trans-identifying students increased 991% over 2 years in wealthy DC suburbs. What's going to happen in 4 years? This was a video. This is a girl who's been taking testosterone for 5 years, and she's getting male pattern baldness. And she does this video. She's not happy that she's discovering that her hair won't come back. If church members know schools are teaching sexual views different than what Jesus taught, and they're silent, just waiting for Jesus to return, they're giving their consent. And Jesus says, if you cause one of these little ones who trusts in me to fall into sin, it would be better for you to be thrown into the sea with a large millstone hung around your neck. So, and Jesus, you know, when you're studying something, you start seeing these verses pop up also. I saw this one in Jesus talking to the church at Thyatira. Thus says the Son of God, his eyes like a flame of fire. He's upset. I have a few things against thee. Thou sufferest that woman Jezebel to teach and seduce my children to commit fornication. So Jesus is having a problem with somebody teaching committing fornication. So, anyway. So, and back to him. So it's going to be a rude awakening for church members who think they are spiritual by not getting involved. When they wake up and realize by their silence they're giving consent to sin, they're inviting the judgment of God upon their head. Here's the thing, and I'm being real spiritual. When they're being silent and they're giving consent to sin, they're inviting the judgment of God upon them. You know, some say, and I've actually talked to somebody, and they said, well, you know, the world has to get more evil before Jesus comes to rapture us, so just do nothing and you know, come Lord, just it's exciting, he's going to come sooner. You know, maybe your response to the evil is revealing how much you really want to be raptured. Maybe the evil is exposing the condition of our hearts. Are we, by standing by silent, consenting to evil, agreeing with evil, siding with evil? You know, the Apostle Paul stood silent as they stoned Stephen. He did not pick up a stone. He did not throw a stone. He stood there, and in Acts 22, he's talking about how terrible he was. He says, and when the blood of thy martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by, consenting to his death. Just by standing there, he knew he was consenting, and he knew he was guilty. Has our love grown cold? You know, Jesus said, in the last days, because evil shall abound, the love of many will wax cold. Matthew 25, and at midnight there was a cry made, behold, the bridegroom cometh, and the foolish virgin said to the wise, give us your oil, our lamps have gone out. And when they went to buy oil, the bridegroom came. And afterwards the foolish virgin said, Lord, Lord, open us. And he answered, said, verily, I say unto you, I know you not. You know, I was reading Ezekiel 9, and the Lord shows Ezekiel this vision of how wicked Jerusalem is. And then the Lord cries and causes them that have charge over the city to draw near. Behold, 6 men came, every one with a destroying weapon in his hand. And he called to the man clothed with linen, who had the writer's inkhorn at his side. And the Lord said to him, go through the midst of the city, put a mark on the foreheads of those who sigh and cry over all the abominations that are done within it. To the others he said, go after him through the city and slay old and young, but do not come near anyone on whom is the mark, and begin at my sanctuary. Now, what's the difference between those that are slain and those that are not? The ones that sigh and cry over the abominations in the city. You know, there's a song, a beautiful song. I heard Kim Walker-Smith do a version of it with little kids singing, and then she sings. But there's a line in there that says, break my heart for what breaks yours. Everything I am for your kingdom's good. Do you think it breaks Jesus' heart to have little kids killed, right? 28 days old, that he made in his image? Amen. Or to have little boys go through chemical castrations, or young women having their breasts removed. He made them in his image. He loves them. And if we're silent, now, I do want to say that maybe you're here and you're hurting, and you're going through struggles in your health, your marriage, your relationship, your finances, and the best you could do is draw your next breath. And my prayer for you is right now, you just need to be restored. You just need to let the Lord love you and put your life back together, and he'll do it. And don't feel any pressure or guilt or anything to do anything. You just need to let the Lord minister to you right now. But you know, there's others of us that are saying, you know what? I tolerated this. I stretched the rubber band and I tolerated something. I really didn't feel good about it, but I tolerated it. And then I stretched the rubber band and I tolerated something else. I really didn't feel good, but I did. And I stretched it, you know, and then finally it's like, you know what? I'm sorry, I can't stretch it anymore. I mean, killing babies 28 days old, I'm sorry, that's a bridge too far. I just can't go there. And what happens is those of us feel that way, cut the rubber band. We'll say, forget this. I'm going to stop caring about and the rubber band is going to snap back, and you're going to get more excited about Jesus than you ever did before, because you're going to finally say, I don't care what anybody else thinks. All I care about what Jesus thinks. So there's a scriptural case that can be made that we should care about what the kids are being taught in our local schools, right? It's a scripture. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Local, local, local. If pastors and churches can be concerned about what's being taught to the kids in their local schools, all the higher races will take care of themselves. I mean, I ran for Congress 3 times, raised millions of dollars. I could tell you all night all the stories about it. Most people, when you talk about that, they're like, oh, that's politics. I can't raise millions of dollars, forget it. But if I say, forget all that, you drive by the school. You know, most school board races are won by fewer people than are in a church. If you just agree on one mama bear mother that's got backbone and say, okay, let's all just agree on her. Do you know 60 school board races were flipped in Colorado last election cycle? Do you know Miami-Dade County was flipped from a liberal to a more conservative school board in the last cycle? Jacksonville, Florida was flipped. This is a doable thing. All right, you just pick one lady, get a bunch of, or a guy, but whoever, and you get people to agree. Say, look, Jesus cares about what the little kids are being taught. You know, one story in the Bible, it's King Josiah. His granddad was Manasseh, wicked Manasseh, sacrificing kids to Molech. And the prophets come to Manasseh and said, it's over, you're killing babies. You're doing the same thing that the people that were here before Israel came in did. And because they did it, I brought Israel in to drive them out. And because you're doing it, I'm going to drive you out. So judgment was pronounced. But Manasseh has a grandson named Josiah. 8 years old when he becomes king. 16 years old, he starts to seek the Lord. And when he's in his early 20s, he tells him to clean out the temple that his granddad had trashed. And they're digging around the temple, and they find the law of God, the scroll. And the Jewish commentator Josephus said it was the last copy of the law on planet Earth because Manasseh was destroying them. And it was the original one Moses had, covered in burlap under a bunch of junk. And they pull it out, and they read it to the king. He had never heard it before. And when he heard it, he rips his garments. He breaks his heart for what breaks the Lord's. And he sends messengers to a prophetess in town named Huldah, the wife of the king's tailor, and to ask what's going to happen. And she says, tell the man that sent you that judgment will come, but not during his lifetime, because he repented when he heard the words of the Lord. And so for the rest of the 31-year reign of Josiah, there was blessings and prosperity. He has this enormous Passover. They send out the Levites to teach the law. And during that revival, this is when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel get saved, right? And so God, from the time he gave the judgment was pronounced, he had this reprieve. I believe people say, what do you think God's going to do? I think maybe God's watching us to decide what he's going to do. If we repent, he'll put it off, right? And he went to... I tell people, God knows the future. He knows all the possible futures. And he tells us what they are. And he lets us choose, right? Deuteronomy 28. If you hearken to the voice of the Lord, you'll be above and not beneath, head and not the tail, blessed coming in, blessed coming out. If you don't hearken to the voice of the Lord, it says all the diseases of Egypt will come upon you. You'll be a debtor, right? The stranger will come in amongst you and rise up above you. So here's the futures, and you get to choose, right? And so I think he's pushing the world to a decision-making moment. You know, we're the bride of Christ. Every love story, Hallmark movie builds up to a decision-making moment. A forsaking of all others and choosing the one. I mean, the whole movie is building up to this one point, right? I believe the Lord's pushing the world, pushing us to a decision-making moment. And he's letting it permeate so that I don't think we're going to sit this one out. I don't think we're going to be able to keep our heads low and hope it goes up. I think he's calling each one of us to make a decision. And some people are going to choose all others. They're going to say, what are people posting about me? What do they say? My friend, I want to be followed. I don't want to be canceled. And other people are going to forsake all others and choose the one. All I care about is Jesus and Jesus only. And I'm going to face him someday. And I want him to say, well done, thou good and faithful servant. So I put a picture of forsaking all others there. Anyway. So, and if we get through this crisis, there'll be another one. We get through that crisis, there'll be another one. You read through history, every generation has a crisis. Jesus says wheat and tares grow together till the harvest. Every generation has crises. And it's like, why is that? Certainly God knew there were going to be crises. You know, we do want to turn things around, but in another sense, the crisis is an opportunity for the people that are alive at that time to show whose side they're on. You know, so I like illustrations. So imagine freshman chemistry class, there's a teacher with a beaker, with a solution inside, and he pours in a catalyst that causes a reaction. And some stuff precipitates and gets heavy and settles to the bottom of the beaker, and other stuff gets effervescent and bubbly and floats to the top of the beaker. So the time period we're living in is our solution in the beaker. The crisis of our time period is the catalyst that's poured in. And some people's response to the crises is to precipitate and drop out and run away and hide, deny their faith, even deny Jesus. Even take the mark of the beast. Oh, I got to have the state provide for me. And other people's response to the crisis is to get more effervescent, more bubbly. When the early church was persecuted, they prayed for boldness. They prayed for more effervescence. Okay, Lord, where do you need me? The crisis is here, right? And historically, the Christians have always run to the crisis, and they've started hospitals and medical clinics and orphanages and wherever the need was. This is our turn. And anyway, so I just want to end by saying someday you're going to be dead. That's a nice way to end the talk. But you're going to be in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. And when we've been there, amen. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing his praise than when we just begun, imagine you've been in heaven 10,000 years and you're walking the streets of gold and you meet Moses. That'd be pretty neat. And Moses invites you over to his place. I don't know what it's like, but Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many mansions, so I bet Moses will have a pretty nice place. He'll probably have one of those big fireplaces where the logs don't burn up. Get it, the burning bush in the wilderness didn't burn up, and the log in the fireplace didn't burn up. I heard one preacher say, in heaven you'll travel as fast as you think, and I'll probably show up late. My wife will say, where were you? I was thinking about something else. But imagine we all gather, and he has a big living room like tonight, and after all the small talk's over, he's sitting right in front of you. You tap him on the shoulder, say, Moses, tell us a story. I read the book, I even saw the movie. But here you are in person. The room will get quiet, Moses will stand up, and he goes, I was 80 years old, and it looked bad. Pharaoh, the most powerful military leader in the world, was wanting to kill us, and he had these chariots and razor-sharp swords. We were totally unarmed, and I just held out my staff, and I said, God, use me to deliver your people. And the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. We're going to look around the room and see David. Say, David, tell us your story. The room will get quiet. David will stand up and say, I was just a teenager, and this thug Goliath was mocking our God, making fun of our faith, and these grown-ups were too chicken to do anything about it. And I said, enough of that. Took my little sling, went out there, hit him in the head, took his own sword and chopped his head off. And then we're going to hear Gideon and Deborah and the Apostle Paul and all the great saints. Oh, it's going to be really exciting. And then everyone in the room's going to look at you. Say, we haven't heard from you yet. Tell us your story. What did you do when it was your turn to be down there on earth? What were they saying about God in your country? Or what did the baby that the Lord knew in the mother's womb, or marriage that God himself instituted in Genesis, or the little kids that God made male and female in his image? What did you do when the whole world was against you? What did you do when there were threats from the government? You know, I'd hate for any of us to be up there and for Jesus to walk in and have a screen come down with all kinds of great things happening, miracles, people coming to the Lord, and him saying, this is what I had planned for you to do when you were down there on earth, but you just didn't have enough faith and courage. And you look down at your life, and that big mountain that held you back, it's a little anthill, this fear of man. What are people going to say about me? What are they going to post about me? He's like, I let that little fear of man hold me back from doing all this great stuff for Jesus? And you can't go back to earth and do anything else for Jesus because you're already in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. But guess what? We're still on this earth. We still have breath in our lungs. We still have feet that trod the soil. You still can do those things you will be known for forever. It's like a basketball game, and Jesus is the coach, and you're on the bench, and he comes over and he says, okay, your turn, get in the game. And you're like, but coach, they're playing really tough out there. Yeah, I know. It's your turn. Get in the game. You're like, coach, somebody just got knocked down. He goes, yeah, I know. You're 7 feet tall. They're 4 feet tall. You can do this. Greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. When the enemy comes in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord raises up a standard against him. Out of the 6,000 years of recorded human history, the good Lord decided for you to be alive right now. He's given you his word. He's given you his Holy Spirit. He's given you a great pastor with Pastor Jack. He's given it to you. This is your chance to shine and do those great things you'll be known for forever. God bless you.